Hello and welcome to Conversations with a Conch. I'm your host, Alex Holden, and this is the third episode. Today I will be speaking with Erin Greene. Erin is a local human rights advocate, certainly one of the most prominent in the Bahamas, and she focuses on LGBT rights, women's rights, and food security. Erin is a political satirist, actor, and performance and visual artist. She is also a regular co-host on the Morning Blend show with Dwight Strawn, which is a local radio program. I wanted to have this conversation with Erin because in times of crisis, sometimes we tend to focus on ourselves and we tend to ignore some of these other issues which are still incredibly important, and often we forget about the most vulnerable amongst us. So without further delay, I bring you Erin Greene. Hey, Erin.
Hi, I can hear you now.
Awesome. Well, we got the technical difficulties worked out. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no worries.
You are the third guest. The first week we had MP Travis Robinson, and the second
Cool.
week we had therapist and relationship consultant Harrison Thompson. And
Nice.
you are the third guest, and I wanted to invite you on because I'm trying to cover the most facing us. Obviously, politics and psychology, mental health, those are all important. But one of the other another issue that is incredibly important, which often might get overlooked in times of crisis, is human rights and social issues.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I Yes. I was looking through my Rolodex, and I didn't even have to look through my Rolodex. I immediately knew that I had to talk to you. So, how I'd like to start off, if it's all right with you, is I introduced you at the beginning with a brief bio, but if you could, in your own words, just and we have domestic and international listeners, if you could, in your own words, uh, tell the listeners what you've been focusing on and just what you like to do and what you've been doing.
All right, cool. So I'm Erin Greene. I'm a local uh, human rights advocate, intersectional human rights advocate with a focus on LGBTI rights as human rights, women's rights as human rights, um, economic rights as human rights, and I've been working for roughly 20 years, actually 20 years now as an advocate. And I think over the last few years, my last sort of big campaign was the gender equality referendum, where I ran a campaign to ensure that no LGBTI negative legislation was entrenched in the Constitution. And as well as that, I've been focused on food security and sovereign human rights.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that's one of the rights that sort of gets left off the table, is food security and perhaps even internet access, even though I believe both of those were classified as essential human rights by the United Nations or designated.
Oh yeah,
Um,
and then there are a number of things that should just be basic, right? Like should just be understood that aren't necessarily officially recognized as human rights by states and governments, but things like the right to a life free of violence, um, and stuff like that. And even even food security. as a right. We don't really focus on an economic rights as human rights. The human rights platform hasn't sort of explicitly focused on, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, just off the top, some people might question why even bother with human rights. Animals are born into this world every day, and it's not like they are protected, even though I actually think that's probably the next big ethical issue of our time. But
And I
for
think
for
they're,
me,
uh-huh.
for me, human rights are just so important, because you're born into this world and you're expected to play your part in the social contract. So for me, part of that social contract, implicit in engaging in that social contract, is the right to having leading a prosperous and happy life. What are your
Yes.
thoughts?
Well, I think I think when we talk about social contract, I think one of those is that we all have a right to a life free of violence, right? And that's not necessarily entrenched explicitly in in constitutions across the globe. But I think
Mm-hmm.
included in that, right, is the right to a life free of economic violence, free of spiritual violence, free of social violence, right, free of psychological violence. Um, and I think you're absolutely right that we don't really focus on this idea that you have a right to a prosperous life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we can interrogate what prosperity means collectively and individually. But on the issue of, when we look at animal rights, um, sort of in juxtaposition to human rights, there is a thought that roots sort of the theory around human rights uh, in this idea of the idea that plants and elements of nature are sentient, right? That
Mm-hmm.
they have a spirit or they have a soul. More important, that they're integral to our existence on the planet and our ability to function on the planet fully and prosperously, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
in that space, animals also have rights.
Yeah, as a throwback, I guess there's two schools of thought on this. There's I believe it was Thomas Aquinas and Immanuel Kant, who famously sort of that their attitude towards plants and animals is that their existence was purely for human consumption and for the benefit of humanity. Whereas you look at someone like Peter Singer, who is definitely one of my favorite ethicists. One of the big proponents of the effective altruism movement, and yeah, he takes a different tack. Whereas I think his approach to rights in nature and humans and everything is, what consciousness does it have? So he approaches animal rights from, do we really have the do is it do we really have the right, or should we ethically be causing these creatures pain for our pleasure?
Right. Look here, absolutely. And that in and of itself is so sort of new for Bahamians, this idea, well, even the idea of human rights for
Yeah,
Bahamians, for
I was gonna say, Aaron, we're like we just leapt right to like the forefront of ethical thinking in, like, Cambridge and Harvard and universities. But we need to remind our audience that we're having this conversation in the Bahamas, which I mean, to be diplomatic, we're not exactly known as sort of the bastion of human rights, are we?
well, no, okay. So I think we, on some fronts, yes, on many fronts, no. it's it's interesting to note that it was at the 1985 CHOGM, like Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, that they then titled, I think, the Nassau Accord, that proclamation was released. And that was all about South Africa and ending apartheid, right? And so Linden and the government at the time was instrumental in the lobby to encourage South Africa and encourage Britain to support the ending of apartheid in South Africa, right? And that was monumental. That's monumental that a small little country would demand that this conversation take place, because we had been, up until a majority rule, we had been living under a similar apartheid state, right?
Yes.
And then you look at 1991, 1992, and the sort of repeal of the replacement of the penal code buggery provisions with the 1992 Sexual Offenses and Domestic Violence Act that would have decriminalized buggery and made sexual intercourse between men in private spaces legal, right? Like that was groundbreaking and took place years ahead. I mean, it's only recently that we had the ruling in Belize with the Caleb Orozco case, calling for the criminalization of buggery in Belize, and then ruling in the Jason Jones case in Trinidad a couple of years ago, sort of doing the same thing. So the Bahamas was at the forefront of the movement to decriminalize buggery in the region. And so you would think that, the Bahamas has got their finger on the pulse of human rights, and they've got this really vibrant movement. But then when we look at other aspects of our social dynamic in the law in the Bahamas, we see that we're far, far behind on some other issues. Like, for instance, I think Bahamas is one of the only countries in the hemisphere, if in the world, countries that does not allow a woman to have a woman to convey her citizenship to her children in the same way that a man can, right? From a married woman. And
that was what the most recent referendum was about, correct?
It was about gender equality and creating constitutional equality between men and women, and would have required us to also change the citizenship provisions to ensure complete constitutional equality, right? So it wasn't necessarily a citizenship issue. It was a gender issue, a discrimination on the basis of sex issue that also required us to remove those discrepancies or the discrimination in our citizenship provisions of the Constitution. And so, even then, there's an instance where we see that, maybe not only should we question whether we can call ourselves a bastion of human rights, but it raised the question of, do we really understand what human rights are and how they operate in the country, how they operate on the planet, and how they operate in secular spaces, right? In non-theocratic states. Because I think, what we found in discussing the various issues raised in the gender equality referendum, like the issues around citizenship and whether a Bahamian woman who has a child abroad can convey her citizenship, or a Bahamian woman with a foreign spouse can convey her citizenship to her children in the same way that a Bahamian man with a foreign spouse can convey their citizenship. And there's also an issue of whether a Bahamian woman can have her citizenship conveyed to her foreign spouse, right? In the same way that a Bahamian man can have his citizenship conveyed to his foreign spouse. And then in bill number 4, so like the first 3 bills dealt specifically with creating constitutional equality and citizenship provisions. Bill number 4 was to entrench the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of sex in the Constitution, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
in all of those issues, I think what arose is that the vast majority of Bahamians feel that they first of all, they feel that they get it. They understand human rights, but for them, they think that human rights are the rights that the Christian God gave you, and that's it.
Mm, mm. Yes, it's sort of Martin Luther, from Martin Luther King. He said, when the laws of man are equal to the laws of God, that's when it will be even. He said something to that.
Well, I look here, I'm not quite certain. Like I'm not familiar with that quote, but I could imagine him
Mm.
saying that. Um, I thought you were going to
Yeah, this is.
reference the form the late Dr. Miles is quoted as saying of the Bahamas uh, conflict with the laws of kingdom, specifically the kingdom, that he would
Mhm.
have to break the laws of the country, right? The laws to follow the laws of the kingdom. And I thought that was fascinating because we were talking about rights. Well, his comments were made at a time when we were talking about human rights, even though he didn't specifically address that, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so, in my 20 years of advocacy, starting with women's rights and looking at and then looking at migrants' rights, and then a heavy focus on LGBTI rights and migrants' rights, and even economic rights. I think what's happening in the Bahamas is that because of our deep rooted
So we ran into a bit of an audio issue here, and in another space down the line. It's about 5 to 10 seconds of faulty audio in each occasion, but you can still glean the context. I apologize, and my plan is to get some better equipment and do this properly. So thank you for your patience. Is it cultural?
country is that a lot of people really believe that yes, you have human rights, but those rights to end your life at any time, or to you don't have full autonomy over your body or the right to full autonomy over your body to kill yourself. God determines when you die, right? As a woman, you
Mm,
don't have a right to an abortion, right? And you don't have the right, in terms of intimate relationships, you don't have the right to be in a relationship with somebody of the opposite sex.
mm.
So, like,
That's
go on.
this is it's so interesting to me because um it seems like we try to legislate equality sort of from the top down, almost like a push function, a la the John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham and John Locke, and when in reality, I think culture seems to be more of a pull function. So what we saw at the last referendum is, I almost want to say, the plutocrats or the educated elite, which is really the political class. We saw them trying to sort of drag us into the 21st century, possibly for international political gain or benefit, maybe to increase our reputation, so we can sort of promote that on the world stage as being a tolerant country. But perhaps to really have a good understanding of human rights, you need that education, maybe that philosophy, that knowledge. You need to actually understand why it's important not to be discriminated against based on immutable characteristics. So I mean, my intuitions are that is the conflict: is we can't pull the population with us. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Yeah, yeah, I feel you, and I think that's a it's I think that's what what went wrong in the referendum, right? Like as somebody who, participated fully in it, I and was um yeah, and had a very difficult time navigating the space because of the objection to my campaign and how it rolled out. I think for me, the biggest issue with the referendum was not that so many people disagreed with the idea of the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of sex, um,
Hmm.
but it was that the state attempted to lead the horse to water and to force it to drink by lying about what it was doing, right?
It did seem that way. Yeah.
Well, I know it didn't seem that way, but there were a lot of things that went down that weren't fully explained, right? And so, even for me, like we're having this exercise where we feel like we're doing the right thing, because constitutional equality between men and women is so important, right? It's so important. Um,
Hmm.
but we were prepared to sort of deny people a basic right in and of itself to achieve that goal. I think the state was very dishonest about what it was doing. I could say that, perhaps they felt that the ends justified the means, right? But
Hmm.
it was a violation of rights in and of itself to try and trick people into doing the right thing.
That's very interesting that you say that. So to steel man this argument, to sort of to give the best argument that I've heard against the referendum, and it's funny. My neighborhood actually was the only sort of precinct or neighborhood in the Bahamas that voted yes on all four motions.
Uh-huh.
But to steel man the argument against, and this is what I heard from someone is someone told me that the word on the street was that Bahamians have this feeling like that their country is not for them, right? That
Hmm.
it's almost optimized for foreign dollars. It's optimized for foreign actors,
Hmm.
and they told me that the reason that this referendum was shot down is because this one of the remaining advantages that Bahamian men have is sort of this sexual hierarchy. If this is their last remaining power that they have, so they told me that it was really as a rebuke to taking away the one thing that they have left, which is just the ability to grant their citizenship to a wife of their choosing.
Boy, look here, and a yes vote for that particular question would not have taken away their right. It wouldn't have taken away their right to have the state convey their citizenship to their foreign spouse, right?
Hmm.
It wouldn't have done that at all. But
Well,
it
no, but
certainly.
it would have granted it to women, which is, and even though it seems illogical, um, they might view that as them sort of losing power because
Well,
they no longer have that one up.
and it's not illogical when you see the when you see the culture in which the state is created. Or let me rephrase that. There's a lecturer at the University of Toronto by the name of Beverly Bain. She's a Trinidadian, Trini Canadian, and she talks about the Caribbean nation state and its construction. And the
Mm,
Caribbean nation state, at its construction, right, at the time of independence, was rooted in patriarchy, right? And rooted
mm,
in this idea that we need strong men to defend the nation, to define and defend the nation, and to fight against the attempt to recolonize, right? And
mhm,
so, all of our nation states in this region are rooted in these ideas of patriarchy and patriarchal ideas. So it's not when you think of that, then you understand why Bahamian men would think that giving foreign men the same rights as they have in their country, right? Because you make them citizens by making foreign men citizens, that those men now can come in and take over a country, especially a small country like the Bahamas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not illogical, but I think that's a part of it, but all of it was rooted in a massive trust deficit with the state, right? So so people and men and women didn't trust that this action would protect the sovereignty of the Bahamian man, right? Some people didn't trust the state and believed that this was an attempt to entrench that there was a massive, that it's all rooted in a massive trust deficit, right? In your example, um, that they don't trust the state to protect them as citizens and to prioritize them in their own country, and that this act of allowing a Bahamian woman to have the state convey her citizenship to a foreign man would give foreign men equal standing in the Bahamas with a Bahamian man, right?
Yeah,
Some
this institutional trust, this lack of institutional trust seems to be contagious. It seems like lots of citizens around the world are losing trust in their governments.
and as they should, because our governments are not acting or operating as or in the spirit of democracy, right? As they say they are. But you know, with our referendum, there were all kinds of issues that arose that caused people to vote no, that were really rooted in a lack of trust with the state, right? And so there was the belief that this was just an attempt to entrench same-sex marriage. It was just an attempt to entrench same-sex rights, LGBTI rights, and in particular, an attempt to advance transgender rights, right?
Oh,
And
was
so a
that
lot of people,
was that on the referendum? I didn't see that.
well, see, here's the thing now. So when we talked earlier about leading a horse to water and trying to make it drink, this referendum was a complex referendum because of the way that it was structured. Like I said earlier, although the first three questions dealt with provisions in chapter 2, which deals specifically with citizenship, the referendum in and of itself was an attempt to create constitutional equality between men and women. And
Right.
to do that, we had to do two things. We had to entrench the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of sex in chapter 3, but also we had to repeal all of the provisions in the citizenship chapter 2, that would constitute discrimination, right? And so here's what happens, or here's what happened. The state only wanted to create constitutional equality between men and women. That was its goal. As far as they were concerned, they wanted to create constitutional equality between men and women. To do that, the state had to entrench the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of sex in the Constitution, right? Which
I
is what
understand.
Bill number 4 would have done.
Yes. No, I understand. And
But
just for
what the
carry
go
on.
on. Or I say what Bill number 4, or what entrenching the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of sex does, though, is that it also, beyond creating constitutional equality between men and women, it says that you cannot discriminate against people on the basis of sex, which means that you cannot discriminate against a woman because she wants to be in relationship with or is attracted to other women. And you cannot discriminate against a person who was born male and now wants to identify or identifies as female, because all of those constitute discrimination on the basis of sex.
Sex or
So the state,
sexual
no,
attraction. or
No. Very simply on the basis of sex,
okay.
right? Because it doesn't matter if I am actually attracted to a woman or not.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that I want to be in relationship with a woman is none of your, it is none of your business, right? You can't discriminate against me because of that. So virtually all LGBTI discrimination is sex-based discrimination. We don't have to identify it as discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. But
Mm.
more importantly, there is no proof or test for sexual orientation,
Yeah,
right?
that's funny. You can't throw them in the lake and see if they float like in the old days.
Right. And even if, even if I tell you I'm queer, that doesn't mean that I am, right? Like you can't prove that. But if I'm going to work and I want to go to work in pants,
Mm-hmm.
and you look at me and you say, well, look here, you're a butch woman, but all the women here wear skirts, and you're only allowed to wear skirts, then it doesn't matter if I'm gay or not. I telling you, I'm a woman and I should be allowed to wear pants if I want to. It has nothing to do with my orientation.
Mm-hmm.
It's discrimination on the basis of sex. If
Mm-hmm.
I identify as trans and I say, hey, I was born or I was assigned at birth female, but I identify as male and I want to live my life as a male, that's discrimination on the basis of sex because you telling me you can't do those things because you were assigned female at birth. It doesn't matter whether I am trans or not,
Mm-hmm.
right?
No,
That
this
gender
makes
identity doesn't matter because what the act in and of itself is discrimination on the basis of sex. So the state only wanted to create equality, constitutional equality between men and women, but the mechanism required to do that
mm-hmm.
does far more. So when the state realized, right, like when the no vote campaign and people realized, and even some of the yes vote campaign, right, the government's own campaign mechanism, when they realized and confirmed that this is true,
Mm-hmm.
that that well, the entrenching the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of sex means LGBTI liberation,
Mm-hmm.
they adjourned the process for further consultation,
Oh
but they
gosh.
only consulted with the church,
They
and
didn't
they said that
they didn't get two parties?
no, I mean it's documented in the media. They said we are adjourning for further consultation with the church, and what they came back with was the provision that was added to Bill number 4,
Mm-hmm.
which would define sex as male or female only, right?
Interesting. Okay, you're
So
teaching me something.
so
I didn't know that.
this was an this was an attempt to halt lesbian and gay rights,
Mm-hmm.
but also an attempt to halt transgender rights, the advancement of transgender rights, right? So
It's
the
so
bill,
interesting. It's so interesting.
uh,
It's almost like they tried appeasement, but it almost looks like the Perry shuffle or something, like they're shuffling backwards.
ah, well, if you remember the beginning of the conversation, um, it's fascinating. If I give you a quick rundown, in 2013, the Constitutional Reform Committee was created,
Mm-hmm.
and they requested contributions from the public, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I made a contribution. Plenty of people made contributions. And then in 2014, the Constitutional Reform Committee released its first recommendation for reform for referendum. And that recommendation was to entrench the principle of well, the word sex in the Constitution where necessary to create um, to create equality between men and women, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or to create gender equality, but to include a proviso to prevent the inclusion of the word sex being used to challenge the ban on same sex marriage.
Ah, wow. That's it. You know
But
what it
when,
is? That just seems
Yeah.
so that seems so cumbersome. You're going through so much work, so much complexity to appease what this one very powerful group.
Right. So when the Prime Minister Perry Christie announced the first issue for referendum, he didn't include the proviso to entrench a ban on same-sex marriage. He didn't include it at all. He didn't even mention it. He didn't even mention that, hey, we're not including that part. So a funny thing happened on the way to the referendum. In August of 2014, almost immediately after the Prime Minister announced what the first referendum issue would be, Loretta Butler Turner, who was deputy leader of the FNM at the time, I think, made a statement that she fully supports the referendum and fully supports constitutional equality between men and women. However, this word sex makes me think about same-sex marriage.
Oh, she said that.
Yeah, and Loretta Butler is the first person to link the referendum to same-sex marriage.
Oh, wow.
And then the Prime Minister came back after the issue was raised and responded to it by saying, we do not think that this is a decision for us to make for future Bahamians. What he didn't say is that Chapter 3, Article 26, 4C of the Constitution permits the state to discriminate, to create laws that are discriminatory in nature or in effect in relation to personal law, which includes marriage, and that the provisions in the Matrimonial Clauses Act and the Marriage Act that constitute a same-sex marriage ban are essentially temporary. That it is an act of discrimination by banning same-sex marriage, but the Parliament is allowed to create these discriminatory laws. C, these laws cannot be challenged in a court, but Parliament can lift the ban at any time, which is why Christie said it's not a decision for us to make for future Bahamians, because the ban as it exists right now cannot be challenged in a court. But tomorrow, or even tonight, right now, Parliament could repeal or amend the provisions in the two acts that constitute a same-sex marriage ban. So that's what happened when he didn't include the proviso in the referendum for a same-sex marriage ban. It's Loretta Butler that raised this sort of fake alarm that we have to be very concerned about same-sex marriage. And so I'm showing you the Prime Minister explaining why, if you are concerned, you don't have to be concerned, because only Parliament can lift the ban. So,
oh gosh, was that some sort of political calculus? Do you think was that?
Well, no,
I
think Loretta brought it up to challenge Minnis, because shortly after that, there was a challenge. Loretta brought it up to challenge Minnis, because Minnis, prior to her statement, Minnis had said publicly, and the Prime Minister reiterated it, that the opposition has given us their word that they will support this vote, that they too believe in constitutional equality between men and women and the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of sex, and that they as a whole will vote yes and support the bills when they were tabled in the House. So Loretta came back after Minnis would have given his word that they would support the referendum. Loretta came back with some some legal understanding that ministers may not have had at the time to sort of goosey him and challenge and create a political dynamic that would challenge or give her better standing, she thought, in a challenge for leadership. The irony is it's a woman who actually created this difficulty or this rift in the movement, right? So when Loretta said that, all the flags went up, and all the people, oh, it's all about same-sex marriage. I knew it, and it was very unfortunate because what some people were saying is, we know that Perry Christie is a homosexual, and we know that it's a party of homosexuals, and we know that this whole thing is just a red herring to achieve same-sex marriage and same-sex rights in the Constitution.
Which is, I mean, it's obviously that's a straw man. That would be an extremely strange way to smuggle those rights in.
A, but B, here's where it gets even more interesting, right? Is that they were only half wrong, right? Like, they were only half wrong because, except for Chapter 3, Article 26, 4C, yes vote on Bill number 4 would have opened the door for same-sex marriage. Right? Because, like I said, Chapter 3, 26, 4C permits the state to discriminate against same-sex couples who want to get married. So, but for Chapter 3, 26, 4C, they would have been correct. But the state never came out and clearly explained that. The state never came out and said, look, you were right. Gender equality means liberation for LGBT people. And it also means that you cannot ban or same-sex marriage and discriminate against people on the basis of their sex, right? And telling me, you are a woman and you cannot marry a woman because you're a woman. If you were a man, you could marry that woman. But because you're a woman, you cannot marry her. See, it's not because you're gay, y'all can't get married. That's not, the law doesn't see that. What they're saying is, because you're a woman, you cannot marry another woman, which is discrimination on the basis of sex. So, for Chapter 3, C, those people would have been correct. The reason I say that they're half right is because the government never took the time to explain clearly what the law is and why in this particular instance they're incorrect, right?
That's so funny because even in the times of so we've had all these crises. We've had Hurricane Dorian, we've had our various economic challenges, we've had our health challenges with the coronavirus. The one criticism that I'm continually levying against the government, and I'm actually more of a fan of this current administration than previous administrations, but the biggest criticism that I often have of them is their communication skills. It's funny. It's almost like all of our problems always come back around to PR and communications between the government and its citizenry.
Right, and this sort of the lack of culture of transparency, honesty, and accountability, which is important because this particular administration campaigned on this idea that they would bring accountability, transparency, and honesty back to governance, right?
Do you think they're saving that? Do you think they're saving that for the elections so they could
no.
You know how most administrations they like to freshen up the roads and put all new street signs. Do you think you don't think the government is going to sign the Freedom of Information Act and just become really transparent?
Okay, so let's break this down. Yes, maybe they will sign the Freedom of Information Act right before the election, right? To make themselves look
Mhm.
good. A. B. Do they actually intend on being transparent or accountable? Necessarily. C. Even in its current iteration, that Freedom of Information Act will not provide Bahamian people with what they think it will, right? Or what they want. It's modeled after, I think it's modeled after the American Freedom of Information Act. And
Mm.
that in many instances allows the state to delay the access to the information to a point where it's no longer useful.
Yes, yes, because the information is so often it's needed urgently. And to bring up another distinguishing factor between the states and the Bahamas is, I mean, even if we had a, this is the problem with signing things into law is sure you might have the law, but then you need compliance and you need competence for them to actually take effect. So
Right.
if anyone knows anything about record keeping or data, I mean, databasing is a foreign concept to the Bahamas.
Right.
If you go in the police station or the hospital, you'll look. They'll have half of the building will be devoted to almost, I want to say, a crypt or
Yep.
some sort of what's the thing under the Vatican, the tomb. There's a but but
Yeah. The
but it's
tomb. The
basically
crypt. Yeah.
it's just rows and rows of file cabinets with paper that no one's ever gonna look at. So I agree with
And
you.
so like you're saying, so what if they sign the act if they don't create mechanisms and institutions to to collect, collate, manage, and disseminate the information, then it's all for naught. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's just the mechanisms. Then we talk about inculcating a culture, right? Culture of honesty, transparency, and accountability in the civil service, because that in and of itself is antithetical to how the civil service runs.
Well, I mean,
Civil
it's
service,
almost it's I want to say, I mean, look, I don't want. I'm definitely not being mean here, but I almost want to say it's antithetical to our culture as Bahamians. I mean, isn't the look, well, we're a fun people and we like to have our fun, but and we're very Christian people. But isn't the joke that what's the joke, Erin? You drink on Friday, you see your sweetheart Saturday, and you cleanse your sins at church on Sunday.
yeah, yeah. But it's
Like,
but and even sort of sort of deeper than that, the the civil service is the Queen's army, right? That's what it is.
mhm,
It's the Queen's service. It's not our service. It's to protect her interests, not ours. Even though we often
mm,
think it's to protect ours, it's not, right?
mhm.
Here's the next thing. Um, it's not necessarily antithetical to our culture, because Bahamians know that information is valuable.
Mm.
Trust me, they knew that information is very, very valuable.
Aaron. So we've been speaking to sort of the bureaucratic entanglement or almost gridlock on all the problems and the reasons why none of this progress that we would want to happen has happened. What's the path forward? How do we how do we pass these equality measures? What are the next steps?
Well, so I think, when I talked earlier about how Bahamians perceive human rights, even people who don't identify as Christian but identify with another monotheistic faith, um, sort of believe that you only have the rights that your God gave you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first step is a cultural step, right? Like the priority needs to be given to the cultural shift. Now, the cultural shift will require legal shifts, but the cultural shift of the legal shifts won't work without the cultural shift. So we need to figure out how to express the human rights principles in a non-fundamentalist Christian sort of way, right?
Are you
It's
saying we need our own version of separation of church and state kind of thing?
or no, we need to invest heavily in exploring the Christian perspective on the issue. And like that's where we need to start, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because people are coming from a very fundamentalist, like, okay, we're talking about rights, and guess what? People have the right to the faith of their choice. So
Mm-hmm.
to have an effective conversation, you have to be able to talk to people without trying to separate them from their faith. You got to interrogate the issue within their faith. Um,
Mm.
but and so it we have to go into that culture of faith, and that's where we have to start. Because, like I say, Bahamians, whether they identify as Christian, whether they identify as kingdom citizens, and that's Miles Monroe's sect, whether they
Mm-hmm.
identify as Rasta or Judeo-Christian, and that's a Judeo-Christian sort of separate from Rasta. We got a lot of young people, they believe in God, but they don't believe in these traditional churches. That's the
Mm-hmm.
space that we have to go into, and we have to interrogate those issues and show people how the human rights platform we're bringing aligns actually does align with their faith, right?
Mm,
We have
so we have to push a compatibilist narrative.
possibly, I that's the first time I've heard that, so I'm not quite sure what you mean, but I think I understand it. We
It
have
sounds good.
to, it does, but we have to go into that space. So for Christians, right? I think it's
Mm-hmm.
important. Well, for the Bahamas, first of all, I think, like I said, it's unfair to say that Bahamians don't understand what human rights are, because we have had this vibrant labor movement, and we
Mm-hmm.
understand labor rights as human rights.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but like when we talk about migration and the freedom of movement, people,
Mm-hmm.
Christians in the Bahamas and fundamentalist Christians will tell you, oh, you have the right to live in the space, to be a citizen of the country that God created you in. So if you were born in Haiti, then don't talk about you have a right to a freedom of movement and the right to migrate to another country for a better life, because what they believe is that God des- God defined what your life is going to be. And
Mm-hmm.
if God created you in Haiti, then your plot in life is to live in Haiti, and you don't have the right to come to the Bahamas or to any other
Mm.
country looking for a better life,
You know
because
this is funny, isn't it? So funny that God always kind of wants the same things that you do.
right. That is, it is
It's
hilarious,
a it's awfully convenient.
right? And so I think an effective discourse in the Bahamas is when you engage Bahamians about what it would be like if somebody tried to force them to be anything other than Christian.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Then Bahamians, they begin to understand it, right?
That's a good tactic. I think I'm gonna take that up. I'd like to have maybe a pastor on the podcast actually to maybe do a deep dive into their views and how they see it ethically.
And so
Uh,
I think that's going to be the most compassionate way, and perhaps the most effective way to engage the issue in the Bahamas, right?
Mm-hmm.
not to challenge people's faith, but to show people how their faith may in fact be compatible with the same message that we're sharing.
That's the challenge, and I suppose you'll be instrumental as perhaps an architect for that sort of vision.
Maybe what you call like a behind the scenes architect, right? Because I think my um, role in the LGBT rights movement has sort of made me a difficult ambassador.
Are you persona non grata?
Oh yeah, and then especially after this gender equality referendum. But because people are going to say you're not really interested in human rights, you're just interested in gay rights.
Oh, right, right. So, is there a? Well, I don't want you to mention any names, put them on the spots, but on the spot. But do you have any pastors in mind or faith leaders that you think would be amenable to maybe working together on this architectural plan?
Oh yeah, I mean there are tons of them. Look here, there are lots of them. There are far more than we would imagine, right? The Anglican Church is the Anglican Church, and I think the Roman Catholic Church are willing to have these conversations and willing to help people align their faith well with human rights, help people to figure out how to be better humans, how to be better citizens, how to be better for each other, how to build better community. I think there are a lot of church leaders that are willing to engage this conversation. And there are a lot of there are a number of church leaders who have already sort of made the shift. Like if we frame it this way, have already made the shift, right? Have are
Mm-hmm.
already down and already engaged these what can become or what can be difficult human rights issues in their church and in their religious communities. And I think we see that at NPCC, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
we see that at NPCC. Now, in terms of the referendum, right? I think that
Mm-hmm.
very few people were aware of the impact or the consequence of the provision in Bill number 4 that defines sex as male or female only. And so a number of religious leaders like the Father uh, Leish Boyd, the Bishop of the Anglican Church, Father
Mm-hmm.
Patrick Pinder, I think the Archbishop or the Bishop of the Catholic Church in the Bahamas or in the region, they would have stood in support of the gender equality referendum, wholeheartedly. But
Mm-hmm.
they didn't understand the extent to which that provision in Bill number 4 would have been detrimental to the people most vulnerable to sex-based discrimination. And so maybe I
Mm-hmm.
should have declared this at the beginning of the conversation. But not only did I vote no on Bill number 4, but I campaigned for a no vote on Bill number 4
Mm-hmm.
because before they added the provision defining sex as male or female only, it was a good bill. But when they added
Mm-hmm.
that provision, that was added in an attempt to halt the advancement of transgender rights and intersex rights and the advancement of LGBT rights generally, right? And so
Erin, you broke up. Could you repeat that last part, Erin?
okay, so I was saying that um, most people were unaware that Bill number 4, that a no vote was the right thing to do for Bill number 4, that
Right, right.
the provision to define sex as male or female only was an attempt to halt the advancement of LGBTI rights and specifically transgender rights. And even if you didn't believe that LGBTI people should have constitutionally protected rights, at the
Mm-hmm.
very least, you should believe that a it's inhumane to have a referendum to prevent discrimination on the basis of sex, but prevent the protection for the people most vulnerable to sex-based discrimination.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
Because at no point did anybody say officially this provision was added to halt the advancement or prevent gender equality being a positive thing for gay people and transgender people. So you don't tell people what it is they're voting for, and you actually not allow, but you encourage gay people and transgender people to vote yes on a bill that would ultimately erase them constitutionally.
You know, I was just
So even
speaking
if
to
you, let me just say, even if you don't
oh, please.
agree with LGBTI rights, any right-thinking person should agree with the principle that you don't encourage people or encourage people to vote against themselves without telling them that's what they're going to do, and that you
Yeah,
don't.
that's a violation of human rights in itself, as you said.
Right. And and not agree with my position, right, and not agree that trans people and LGBTI people should be protected in the Constitution. You don't have to agree with
Mm.
me, but surely you should tell people, especially members of the LGBTI community, that your yes vote is going to erase you constitutionally. And I think it's
Mm.
unchristian, inhumane, it is indecent to have a referendum to entrench the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of sex in the Constitution, but then prevent the groupings most vulnerable to sex-based discrimination from accessing those protections.
Can you speak to it? What is it like? Because we've obviously we've come quite a ways on the LGBT community. It's not facing as much discrimination as it was, say, 15 years ago, right?
Or even maybe even 30 years ago, maybe, right? Like there have been improvements, there have been advancements without a doubt. Like when I started my advocacy, I went to a UN event, and I had a badge for the event. I had an ID badge for the event. And
Mm-hmm.
I was wearing the same clothes that day that I wore in the picture for the ID.
Mm-hmm.
And a police officer closed the door on me. Like he let the door slam in my face as I was trying to enter the event, and then questioned me as to why I was there, even though I had clearly had on a badge indicating that I was allowed to be there. Right? Now, at the
Wow.
same time, while things have improved, we do see pushback in some small spaces, right? And we do see
Mm-hmm.
individual people still experiencing some of the same things that they would have experienced 20 or 30 years ago. So, and a lot of the pushback is, and a lot of the violence uh, is experienced by gender non-conforming queer people, right?
Right. Oh,
And so,
I understand that. So this is the people, if you're born a male, you might want to dress as a female, or
right,
perhaps we would know them as the flamboyant ones.
right, effeminate or femme presenting men, masculine presenting women, and then trans men and trans women, right? Through that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
spectrum. And so we're finding that this is sort of been a pushback where people are sort of saying, well, I understand gay rights, but I will never tolerate you wanting to change your body, right? Why you don't
Mm.
want to live in the body that God gave you? And
Mm-hmm.
so, gender non-conforming queer people and straight people, people who identify as straight, are still dealing with violence. We still have issues with accessing police services, and it's that's more in the realm of respectability politics, right?
Hmm.
Where an officer may say, I don't have a problem with gay people, but why you use a man? Why you in here in a dress?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That type of kickback,
You
pushback.
know that almost seems like a side effect of our sort of our personality. We're quite a homogenous culture.
Right.
We all like our KFC, we like our Nikes, we like our church, we like our Netflix, we like our Hennessy. I mean, it, just
And
looking at
so,
just looking at the drinks that we drink in the bar, we all love rum and coke. We're not. It's funny. We're kind of like Japan in the way that we're a homogenous culture, but almost like in a sloppy, fun way. Except
yeah,
obviously, it's not fun for the minorities who are
everybody.
being discriminated against.
Right. And the people on the fringes. And so, I think you got it right. What we experiencing is the intersection of uh, homophobia and transphobia, or um, heteronormativity and respectability politics, right? So
Hmm.
we could see another example of it with the Rastafarian community and religious-based discrimination, right? And people will say, you can
Yeah.
have locks, but they should be neat, right? Like
Hmm.
you could, like you don't, there shouldn't be a problem with you wearing locks. You're a black person, and that's your natural hair. But for God's sake, clean it up and make it neat, make it respectable, right? That's another
Well, I
place
mean,
where,
honestly, Aaron, if we could make locks illegal, they should be illegal for white people.
right? And then we're talking about cultural appropriation, but let's get into it. I'm gonna tell you why. So watch this. Uh, it wasn't until the 40s and 50s that the last Caribbean country repealed the law that you could shoot a person with dreadlocks on sight, right? And I think that country was Dominica. Dominica would have been the last country in the region to repeal the law that you could shoot a person with dreadlocks on sight. Now,
What? I've never heard of this law.
yeah, man. So when you look at like so as a white Bahamian, I don't know if you identify as white Bahamian, but you would be identified as white Bahamian. But as a phenotypically white Bahamian, if you're looking at black Bahamian families, you may have asked yourself, why are parents and why are people so hung up about locks, right? Well, why
Yeah.
is
Why?
it? Well, because in from the 1950s and back, your child could leave the house with locks and get shot for no reason other than they had locks, never come back home, and there's nothing you could say or do about it because that's the law. So I imagine that people tried to beat that out of their children, like, no.
Mm.
And then culturally it became demonized, right? And then we forgot why we wouldn't let the children wear locks, right? We forgot that. And then we just in this
That's
place where all locks are bad, right? But when
that's
you
so
realize
interesting.
that it wasn't until fairly recently that the law was repealed, then you realize why people are so weird about it, right?
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and you get a sense of it. But if you didn't know
Yeah.
that, you would be like, why are people behaving this way? So why it should be illegal for white people to wear locks is because they ain't gonna never get shot with locks.
Oh,
For
so
like that, like the locks won't be the reason alone. That won't be the only reason.
so obviously, I was making a joke on the white people with locks. Obviously, I think no, I don't think anyone should be discriminated against based on immutable characteristics, and we can actually talk about this, but even cultural appropriation for me, I think it's the spice of life. I think almost every great thing in our story, the story of humanity, has come from trading aspects of culture. Imagine British food if or imagine Portuguese food if the Gamma had never gone to collect spices from the east. We'd live a very bland existence. But
Right, but
obviously, yeah.
however, you still have to question though, how do I feel as a person that I will eat your food and I will claim it as my own. Like I have the right to eat this if I want because it tastes good, as I continue to deny your humanity. Now, I'm not saying that you should get violent or lock up people, white people, or non-Africans who want to wear locks. And by African, I don't mean like because I include Aboriginals and because we all the indigenous people, we started in Africa. But you have to acknowledge the privilege that you have as a non-African wearing locks. And also understand that African people who wear locks are treated far differently than you. So what does it mean for you to wear locks, right? Like, so I'm not saying you shouldn't be allowed to have them, but I think with having them comes an obligation to understanding the culture they originated from.
Yes, we need to. It's basically to stop the hypocrisy. It's that's what we, yeah.
Yeah. So like, yeah, if you want to wear locks, right? But if somebody asks you if you think it's appropriate for you to wear locks, come out my face is only here. Be willing to hear or to try to understand why Africans in particular would be upset about it, right? Because like for me, if I tell you the experiences I've had wearing locks with police officers, right? My man,
I've
I've
never
had
seen you
some
in locks.
well, because I was tired of getting harassed by police, I cut them off. I could be
Wow.
honest. I could be honest, right? Like with what I was doing and with all the other pressure I was dealing with discrimination and marginalization and threats of violence, with the LGBT thing, LGBTI advocacy, I cut them off. And then I can show you why. So a few years ago, about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I think 3 years ago, I decided I was going to lock up again. I grew my hair for a year plus, spent a weekend locking it up, and by Saturday afternoon, I was done. And I told T, okay, we could go out now that my hair's done. We could go out and do some errands. And we got in the car and left the eastern end of the island, and we hit Wolf Road. And we were in, where the two lanes merge, coming from
Yes.
Burnett Road over to Wolf Road. So we were in the right lane, and we were attempting to overtake a police car. No lights on, no siren. They were doing about 15 miles an hour. We used our turn signal. I used my hand signal, and the police pull us over. And the police officer came out the car and approached the car, and he was in full force mode, right? Like he was he was very alert and very concerned about this person he's approaching in this car. And when he heard my voice, he recognized it and he said, "Oh, you're Erin Greene." And I said, "Yes." And his demeanor changed immediately. Hear me?
Yeah.
Now, the second officer in the car came out and I could see him in my side mirror. And he had his hand on his holster and his hand was shaking, right? Because as far as he's concerned, we've pulled up on two men with locks in a vehicle and we don't know what they're going to do. The second officer called out to the first officer and said, "Hey, is everything okay?" And he said, "Yes." And he shouted back, "Are you sure?" And the officer said, "Yes, man, everything is cool." And it was only then that the second officer took his hand off his holster and relaxed.
So they profiled you.
Right. That's what it is. They profile, right? And I mean, it was the moment that I got the locks back, that I had twisted my locks again. And it had not happened it had not happened all the time that I had a low cut, right? In fact, an incident that happened shortly before that, where my partner who has locks and my hair was about 2 years uncut and uncombed. And this police officer pulled on us and he wanted to root us up.
Wow.
But what initiated the contact from a distance, I saw him, and I realized what he saw in the car was two young men, unkempt, one with locks and one who don't like to comb their hair. And it happened on the same day of the mini riot on the wharf with the Segway driver,
Oh
the
God.
tour guide. And I
Yeah.
realized that he was upset and probably feeling powerless, and saw what he appeared to be two young black men that needed policing,
Yeah. Yeah. So
right?
so
And
do you have
go on.
any sympathy for police who might profile?
Yeah, man. Like even in that particular officer, once I got home and realized, because we were unaware of what was going on the wharf,
Mm-hmm.
right? So once I got home and realized that here is this officer who was in that scuffle, who
Mm-hmm.
had tourists calling him pig, and people, I
Oh
sure they calling
gosh.
him your sissy cops and your this and your that and your pigs, and you're all so disgusting. He's a bicycle cop, so he's
Are
wearing
we talking?
shorts.
We're talking American tourists would be saying this to
Yeah,
the police.
yeah, because when I saw footage online, oh, there were tourists who were talking, uh, there were tourists who were trying to tell the cops to calm down. There were tourists who were telling the cops that there was unnecessary behavior, action. It was their behavior was unnecessary. There were Americans calling the cops pigs, right? So
Is it just? Is it? Yeah.
when I got home and I saw video footage, I realized this bicycle cop in shorts
Mm-hmm.
probably got rooted up in this little scuffle, and had people not supporting the police but denouncing the police, and then is walking back to the station, no bicycle, no radio, no
Mm-hmm.
ticket book. All he had on him was his gun and his cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure he felt humiliated and disempowered, right? And
Emasculated even.
right, and emasculated. And when he walked around that corner onto Elizabeth Avenue North, he saw in the distance two young men in a car that was overtaking. He accused me of
Mm-hmm.
overtaking illegally or improperly. So when I told him, you obviously saw my hand signals, you saw the person in front of us throw their car on the sidewalk, and you saw my turn signal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then he was like, "Oh well, you didn't do this the right way." And I told him, "Boss, no, 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 no. I'm not on it. You're gonna need to." And then he took my driver's license and walked around the corner, right? Because I think he was trying to figure out what to do when he realized who it was. What he was trying to do was get his power back. And I felt nothing but sympathy for him, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he never showed up to court. And we spent 3 years dealing with that matter. So I felt
Oh
sympathy
wow.
for him. And
Mm.
and and understanding the police culture, understanding how they're trained and what they're trained into. I understand how they develop these attitudes, right? I get it.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding how imperialism works, how colonialization works, how living on a plantation works, and like how we talked about earlier, where people feel like this is you're a citizen in this country, but the country is not for you. The opportunities are
Mm-hmm.
not for you, right? I get it.
Mm-hmm.
I get it. But at the same time, this boy he was rough. He didn't have on his proper uniform. His number wasn't properly displayed on his sweater. He didn't have a radio. You take my phone and you go around the corner with my ID on your phone, and I'm a gay rights activist who's already been experiencing threats that the police wouldn't investigate.
Mm.
And even with all of that, I could understand the difficulties that he probably was going through with his day, the overall police culture that makes it difficult for police officers to operate against the culture. I get why police officers behave their way with young black men, because this is a plantation. This is a post colonial state. They are trained to believe that young black men are the enemy. Like, I get it. I get it.
Mm.
I understand it. And so often I advocate for police from the perspective of the citizen that wants better behavior and better engagement with the police. They're undermanned, they're under resourced, they're underpaid, they don't have access to psychosocial services, they don't get the counseling they need, they don't get the training they need, and they're left to deal with situations that are beyond their control in many instances. And then on top of
Perhaps
that,
even beyond their training.
right. And then on top of that, they're operating in a political culture where politicians and people with influence and affluence feel no weight about coming in and demanding that somebody is somebody should be released, or machinating to have somebody released despite the police investigation. I get it.
Mm.
And I'm concerned about their rights as well. I'm concerned about their safety as well. But I can't give up my rights. I would. That's not how it
No,
works. And in fact, that's not how human rights work, right? But that's
no, it's
another
not.
example, right? That's another example of like the intersection of respectability politics and right to the right to freedom of expression, which we
Hmm.
have in this country, um, the right to freedom of conscience. But there are all of these intersections that make delving into these issues even more complex. But I tell you what,
It's a compound interest, but for
right?
social issues.
The good thing is that more and more people are articulating how they feel about how they feel in their own country, how they feel about issues affecting them, how they feel about rights and how they're being treated. And more people are willing to listen to conversations about human rights, about why they're important. I will say this though, we're not doing enough as advocates, the state. We're not doing enough to help people articulate their thoughts and frame them. We're not doing
Hmm.
enough to expand the conversation. And if to make a point, the Bahamas is currently sitting on the UN Human Rights Council. And a part of that
Hmm.
process, we committed to creating an NHRI, which is a National Human Rights Implement or Institute, because it could be, you
Hmm.
can start at various levels. And the state hasn't
Hmm.
even mentioned it, right? There seems to be little to no political will. Our civil society is rooted in a human rights platform,
Hmm.
right? And so even in the civil society space, we see a number of challenges where, like representatives, faith-based communities in the space don't really understand that their right to freedom of conscience and freedom of expression is equal to my as to freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, um, non-discrimination on the basis of sex, right? And so it's we still have a lot of work to do in building a human rights framework and platform in the country, and getting people at an organizational or infrastructural level to understand how human rights and our commitment individually and collectively as a nation uh, impact or import into their as civil servants, right? Still a lot of work to do.
Hmm. It's almost ironically, and this is a terrible quote to draw, but in this case, the work actually will set us free in regards to human rights.
Yeah, it will. And I think that people are not as opposed to it as we think they are. It's that the people that they trust keep engaging the conversation in an adversarial way or in an anti-human rights way, right? So I'm
Hmm.
Christian, my family all Christian, and I go to church and I trust my pastor. But every time I talk to my pastor about human rights, you know he's saying things like, well, to honor God, this is what you got to do. And to honor God, this is what you got to believe. When other schools of thought or other religious leaders would say, hey, by by operating in grace and giving people who don't agree with you or have the same faith as you the space to live a life free of violence, you are honoring God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes.
it becomes difficult for people to navigate or navigate human rights and still maintain their faith because it's being presented to them as a dilemma, right?
Mm.
As
It
diametrically opposed issues by religious and social and political leaders.
Yeah, and that's a false dichotomy. We can go for the term that I coined earlier, compatibilist narrative.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
without a doubt. And
Erin,
that's yeah. Sorry.
Erin, I gotta say, I actually I didn't expect this conversation to go into this much detail, but I'm actually really happy it has. I gotta tell you, you've really opened my eyes to a lot of the depth and complexity of these issues in the Bahamas. So I just wanted to thank you.
Yeah, man. No problem. No problem. And I think, like you said, right, the one of the biggest issues facing the government it's bad PR and communication strategies, right?
Hmm,
And
hmm, hmm.
one of the issues that's really hurting us collectively is our inability to maintain or sustain a coherent collective dialogue, right? And
Hmm.
so the truth is that I don't think that Bahamians are inherently evil or bastards or barbarians. I don't think that Bahamians are actually opposed to human rights. I think that we have not had a conversation, a sufficiently grounded, collective, cohesive, coherent, cogent conversation where all of the ideas can be laid out on the table and we thresh, we move through them as a collective. Because I think
We
when
need
it's
a
all
we need
broken
a national
down,
we need a
say
national discourse.
right. Because I think when it's all broken down, most people will say, yeah, you know what? Maybe live and let live is the best option because I don't want anybody to tell me I can't be a Christian. So
Hmm.
I'm not ever going to tell somebody that they can't be gay or they can't be Rasta or they can't be Muslim.
This is my argument. I mean the argument I make, the best one ethically, is you did not choose your birth. You did not choose your circumstances. You did not, and I mean some ignorant people say that you can choose your sexuality, but I think anyone who's honest with themselves knows that they can't change who they're attracted to.
Uh-huh.
It's all a cosmic dice roll. So you once you accept the facts that you literally your spirit could have been born into any physical vessel with any social status or any characteristics, you realize that it's only fair to not deny people rights based on these characteristics. So for me,
Uh-huh.
it's quite intuitive. Erin, I think you've inspired me. I think I have to get a faith leader on the podcast to hear. I wonder if they can give an argument against human rights. And I think
Yeah.
it would be interesting to hear someone actually argue against equality. Although I doubt they would. I can't see them doing it seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. I think and I think when you even for these pastors who we just assume are, who are just anti-human rights, when you remove them from like the when you remove them from the church politics, right?
Hmm.
And you get right down to the nitty-gritty of Jesus's words as laid out in the Bible as and what people call liberation theology. That even those people, they agree. They agree that God gave you free will
Hmm.
to make the choices that you want to make. God told you, and Jesus told you not to judge other people focus on yourself. Your salvation is on yourself, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and even when we look at that Judeo-Christian space, right? Because the Judeo is a collective salvation space, and the Christian is a personal salvation space, right? Even when we go to
Mm-hmm.
that sort of Old Testament collective salvation space, um, and we take the politics out of it, you find that people understand the need to let people be who they are, even when it affects the collective.
Mm. So you're not. We want tolerance, but we don't have to tolerate intolerance.
Well, not that, but that that's a bit tricky, right? But we understand that everybody has a right to a life free of violence,
Yes, yes. I th-
right? Like
Erin,
I boil it down to that. The
I
understanding that, go on.
no, no. I was gonna say. I like that. I think that's fundamental. A life free of violence, and yeah, I look forward to our upcoming political discourse on this. I know you're doing a lot of work bringing it to the forefront of perhaps the government's attention. So no, I'm glad.
Yeah, I'm just hoping that because for me, I think as an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist activist, I think that
Hmm.
ultimately these isms are tools of an imperialist agenda whose intent is to keep us distracted and not
Hmm.
focused on a bigger picture, right? Because imperialists, they don't care who you are, what you are. The intent is to own everything. Like the intent is to control everything, right? And it's
Well,
this
it's in the name. Imperialism, I believe, is power and conquering.
right. And so, I think that all of these isms are a tool to distract us from a larger agenda to
So,
control everybody, regardless of race or sexual orientation, right? Or
divide and
faith.
conquer.
Right, right. And
Mm.
so I think it's really important for us to understand that, and to figure out how we are going to work together to ensure that everybody can do what they want to do, understanding that they don't have the right to negatively impact other people,
Mm, mm. That's
and
yes, yes.
negative impact actually is, right?
Yeah, you have your freedom, but you don't have the freedom to encroach on other someone else's freedom.
Right, absolutely.
Aaron, we're coming up on an hour and a half now, and I'm getting mindful of your time. Um, I I think before so I think instead of opening up the Pandora's box of conversation on capitalism and I suppose capitalism and its discontents, um, I think that would be a great next topic if you would indulge me in the future,
Yeah, man, absolutely.
because I think you know I have my own problems with capitalism, but I think there might be something interesting to dive into there on what we dislike and what we like and what we should keep and what we should throw away. So let's, yeah, I think we should save that and maybe we'll dig that up next time. Um,
Yeah, man.
Hey, so I wanted to say thank you for the conversation. It's so enlightening, and you've inspired me to get a faith leader as a guest. Um, before I let you go, would you have time to answer five rapid fire questions?
Sure, sure, sure.
Thank you so much. I do these questions with every guest, and they're sort of a fun, lighthearted way to end some serious conversations.
Uh
Um,
huh.
and answer them in one word or however long you feel like you want to take. So
Okay.
here we go. Question one: Click or Sans?
Hey, Sans, Pink Rattler.
Beautiful. Oh, I love it. I love it. It's so refreshing on a hot summer's day, isn't it?
Yep, yep.
Oh,
Plus, I
yeah.
can't drink regular beer. It's too strong for me.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, it's I believe at 2.5% with a lot of sweet grapefruit, pink grapefruit juice. It's pretty refreshing. So you won't get too
Yeah.
drunk off of a couple of them.
Yep, yep.
Question two: What is your favorite family island?
Ah, hmm. I haven't been to all of them yet. It's a pull between. I think Andros is my favorite.
Andros.
Yeah.
Lovely. That's the one island. One of the one islands I haven't been to actually. I'll have
I
to.
think okay. I camped out at on Mount Alvernia on
Hmm.
Como Hill in Cat Island. Camped out in
Hmm.
Camps Bay in Andros. Been to Andros plenty times. My family from Andros. I come from a long line of Chickchani catchers. I love Eleuthera. Used to go to Eleuthera almost every summer, but I think Andros is the best right now for me.
Okay, I'll have to stack it as my next vacation destination. Put it in my calendar.
Hmm.
Um, Number three, what is your how do you take or what is your favorite style of conch?
Oh boy, favorite style of conch. I okay. It's between stew conch and conch salad.
Okay, that's both will heal you up on a Sunday after
Yeah,
perhaps too
I
many
can't
radlers.
I can't choose. I can't choose between the two of them.
Okay, I won't force you to choose, so don't worry. Um, Question number four: Is the Bahamas a real place?
Um, yeah, the Bahamas is a real place. It's obviously a real place. In fact, it's like the realest place on the planet, right? It's a real place.
Oh,
It's a real.
that's a
It's
it's
a real
real.
plantation. Yeah, it's a real plantation.
Oh man, okay. I gotta tell you, I cannot wait to discuss plantation economics with you next time we link up. That'll be a fun conversation.
Yeah, man.
Number five, if you had a magic wand and you could wave it and get whatever effects you wanted over our beautiful archipelago, what would you what magic would you bestow upon us?
I would diminish entirely the impact of ontological Americanness. We
I
are
love it.
so we are so close to the U.S. that I was born in '76, right? So I think maybe my generation and every generation beneath me is more American than they are Bahamian, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Because the larger
mm-hmm,
culture consumes smaller culture,
mm-hmm.
and that's even if you're working at it, that happens. And we haven't been working at it, at growing our culture and protecting it, preserving it, growing it, understanding it. I think from my generation on, the majority of us identify more as American than Bahamian, and that's
Yeah,
problematic for a number of reasons.
I imagine we'll cover a lot of those reasons in our next conversation. That's
Yeah.
that you're speaking to my heart with that criticism. I 100% agree. Um, wow, yeah, that's you hit it on the nail. Erin, where I can put this in the show notes if you don't have the information on hand, but
Hmm.
if people are interested in your work, they want to support it in any way, where can they contact you? what should they do? Do you have a Twitter handle or anything like that?
Well, they can contact me on Facebook, and my profile is Erin Greene. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I am an advocate, and I work for the devil, right? So that's how they could identify me, because I'm a devil's advocate. If they find other Erin
So,
Greenes,
mm-hmm.
so I'm, when it says who, where do you work? So
Mm-hmm.
I work for the devil as an advocate.
Okay, you work
So
for the devil as an advocate, and they
th-
can
th-
just look you up by looking for the red horns on your head, right?
well, if they find multiple Erin Greenes, right? That's one way they could identify me. Um, because there are a couple of Erin Greenes in the Bahamas, believe it or not.
Okay.
But you can find me there, or you can email me at ERINLV, L is in lasagna, V is in vanilla,
Mm-hmm.
green with an E on the end at gmail.com. You can also contact a Facebook page called BLEA, or Bahamas LGBT Equality Advocates, and you can contact me there as well.
All right, beautiful. Erin, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure, and I loved having you on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Yeah, man, this was super cool. Thanks for the invite.
Yes, yes. Well, until to be continued.
Yes, sir. I'll be here.
Okay. Stay safe.
You too.
Bye.
Bye bye.
So that is the end of episode 3 with Erin Greene, focusing on human rights and social issues in the Bahamas. It may have gotten a little bit bureaucratic and perhaps complicated for our listeners outside of the Bahamas. So, what I'm going to do is in the show notes or on the website soon to be published, I'm going to add some documents for further reading if anyone is interested in the law or any details within it. So, I'll do that. And obviously, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, share it with your friends and family. Tell people about it. You can rate it on iTunes. If you give it lots of stars, you'll be helping disadvantaged communities in the Bahamas and also podcasters like myself. So that would be great. And if you have anything to say about it, any questions, you can tweet at me or shoot me an email at conversationswithaconch@gmail.com. And that'll be it basically. So thanks so much, and I'll see you next episode.